All right, everyone. So we're going to get started. I'd like to welcome you to this installment of the APLS Student Committee webinar series. The American Psychology Law Society is Division 41 of the American Psychological Association, APA, and includes scholars, researchers, and practitioners of various disciplines who work at the intersection of psychology and law. The APLS Student Committee provides an array of resources and experience for student members interested in psychology and law, including this webinar series. So the purpose of the webinar is to engage our members and members from other organizations in interactive discussions with field leaders in psychology and law. We aim to strengthen the student community within APLS and other organizations, and also provide our student members with translatable skills needed to succeed in their current and future careers. We're very excited to present Dr. Chriscelyn Tussey tonight, who will be discussing forensic neuropsychology. My name is LaDuke. I'm chair of the APLS Student Committee, and I'm going to be your moderator. A few logistics before we get started. We have individuals attending this webinar on their computers and also their phones. Just as a heads up, the interactive features of this webinar, so the slides, any polls that we do, the ability to ask questions, those will only be available to those accessing the webinar on their computers. This webinar will be a mix of presentation and questions, so please use the chat box in the bottom left corner of your screen to write in questions throughout the webinar. I'll be curating them throughout and we'll address all of them towards the end. There's also the option of asking your questions live, which I'm going to explain at the beginning of the question and answer section of the webinar. This webinar is being recorded and it will be available on the APLS Student Committee website shortly after the conclusion of the live presentation. If there's any logistical questions for me throughout the webinar, please write those in the chat box as well. I'll be checking for those. So again, we're excited to present Dr. Chriscelyn Tussey to discuss forensic neuropsychology, essential information to know before embarking on the path less but increasingly traveled. Hello, Dr. Tussey.
Hello. Hi, thank you very much for the introduction. And I wanted to say welcome everybody. Thank you for listening in on this. I hope this is informative, and I was very excited whenever Casey asked me to give this talk because forensic neuropsychology is something that I feel really passionate about. I think it's a great career niche, and I also think that there's a lot of development that's going to happen in it over the next several years, and so it's exciting to see all the people that registered, and hopefully you'll be contributing to this niche in the future. So I wanted to also start out by saying thank you to both Casey and to Megan for inviting me and all of the great work that they've done with the APLS Student Committee. If you're not involved in that already, I highly, highly recommend it. They have a plethora of resources available, and it's really great networking opportunities and opportunities for building your future career within forensic psychology. So thank you both, especially for inviting me and all of the great work that you've done. I know that you hosted a talk at APLS just last week on making neuro work for you, and I think that this is going to be a follow-up to that introduction. The goal of this talk is really to try to introduce some fundamental information for you, anybody who's considering the niche of forensic neuropsychology. So let me tell you a little bit about myself as we go on. I obtained my doctorate degree in clinical psychology from Indiana University of Pennsylvania, and I obtained my internship at Bellevue Hospital Center in the forensic track and through NYU School of Medicine. Throughout graduate school, I was fortunate to get practicum training in forensic psychology at a federal correctional center, as well as neuropsychology, and that's really when my interest started growing in both of these areas throughout my clinical experiences and some research that I did looking at juvenile psychopathy, which also included administration of some neuropsychological screening measures. So after I obtained my doctorate degree, I received a one-year postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Virginia, where I worked at the Institute of Law, Psychiatry, and Public Policy with Dan Murray and Dave Rawls, and I was fortunate to have really fantastic training in that area. And afterwards, I completed a two-year fellowship in clinical neuropsychology, also at the University of Virginia, with wonderful mentors, again, such as Dr. Donna Broshek, Bernice Markopoulos, and Jeff Barth. So along my way, I felt I've had some really amazing mentors and sponsors and people who've helped pave the path toward me working in this interest area. I am board certified through the American Board of Professional Psychology in forensic psychology, and am pursuing board certification in clinical neuropsychology as well. And I currently work at Bellevue Hospital as the Director of Psychological Assessment, so I oversee really all of the psychological assessment, forensic and neuropsychological and clinical, inpatient and outpatient. And I also teach from time to time as an adjunct at John Jay University. Lastly, the other reason that I'm so excited, I think, to be part of this webinar series is that I really, truly love working with students, and that's a big part of my job at Bellevue. And it's not only my job as the Director of Assessment, but I'm also the coordinator of the Neuropsychology externship track at Bellevue. And I know that we have a lot of respondents from really all over, but if you're here in New York City, you know that externship is a very, very busy, competitive, almost like a mini internship process. And so I'm fortunate to have experienced both sides of this coin. In addition to the work that I do at Bellevue, I own a private practice called Metropolitan Forensic and Neuropsychological Consultation. And as the name implies, I largely do forensic and neuropsychological evaluations, both clinical and forensic, and consultation as well. So at this point, just so that we can make the slides bigger and get rid of any delay with my picture, I'm going to actually get rid of the camera and start going through the slides. And then, as Casey said, these will all be available at the end of this talk. I know that he was going to actually administer a poll so I could get an idea of who the audience is in terms of your background. And I was wondering, Casey, if you're able to do that and we could get some information about you, because this will help me tailor my presentation appropriately. Okay, it's looking like we are getting the targeted audience predominantly as forensic graduate students, and we have some neuropsychology graduate students, a few early career professional neuropsychologists. So if you haven't voted, if you could just put your vote in really quick, and then we'll close that. And I see, just looking at the chat box, that there's at least one person that's both neuro and forensic and work in a state hospital, so that's wonderful. You have a little bit of both. All right, so this is great. It looks like, again, the majority of the audience are graduate student forensic psychology. And so I'm going to go ahead and close this poll up, but know that I have really tried to integrate information about becoming a forensic psychologist, but a lot more emphasis on becoming a neuropsychologist, and then how to integrate the two for forensic neuropsychology. As everyone on here may be aware, forensic psychology is its own distinctive niche that was identified by APA as a specialty area in and of itself in 2001. Neuropsychology is its own specialty identified through APA in 1996, but there's not a forensic neuropsychology specialty defined, for example, by APA. So what you're going to be hearing throughout this talk is my attempt to explain how competence and really both forensic psychology and clinical neuropsychology are, in my opinion, essential to working in this area. And it really all starts with a strong foundation in clinical psychology, which it seems, based on the poll, also that everyone on here, nearly everyone on here, has. And so the goal of this talk really is to go over some brief history of these areas, the definition and the growth that I see within the field, talk about the ethical, legal, and clinical considerations that you would want to keep in mind, as well as provide some insight into the type of training that you would need if you want to do forensic neuropsychology work. and offer some examples of the type of work and evaluations that you could do, and also some insight into the future of this area. So briefly to start, forensic psychology, as has been defined by Tom Grisso, is really an intersection between psychology and law, and it's our opportunity to provide information to the trier of fact, whether it be a judge or a jury, to help address legal situations or legal questions. Neuropsychology is the study of brain and behavior relationships, and this is where an individual applies standardized assessments to help tap into figuring out one's functioning in areas such as attention, memory, processing speed, etc. I thought it would be helpful to put up here the definition of a neuropsychologist. You'll see NP or FNP for neuropsychologist or forensic neuropsychologist throughout this talk. This definition is the one purported by NAND, the National Academy of Neuropsychology. It's somewhat like an APLS, but of neuropsychology. And as you're going to hear later on, neuropsychology actually has a lot of different groups compared to forensic psychology. So the NAND definition of a neuropsychologist in 2001, and they're currently in works to revamp this, but really the minimal criteria to call yourself a clinical neuropsychologist requires a doctoral degree, an internship, the equivalent of 2 years, at least one of which is at the postdoctoral level in the study of clinical neuropsychology and related neurosciences. I will add that it truly, after 2005, most people have been getting 2-year postdoctoral fellowships in neuropsychology, and I'll speak more to that later on. And then you also have to be licensed in your state or province to practice independently. So that leads us to this emerging niche. Now that we know what forensic psychology is and provide a definition of neuropsychology, I hope everybody's controlling themselves, and I hope everybody gets this joke. Control your emotions by amygdala. So forensic neuropsychology is the practice of providing neuropsychological evidence and opinions to assist the trier of fact again in resolving some sort of legal issue or question. Thank you all for the smiling faces and the laughs because of the joke I'm seeing in the chat box. So forensic neuropsychology has been defined actually by many individuals in the field, but this Griffenstein and Slobogan definition, I think, are a nice brief summary of what it is. And you know, we used to think of forensic neuropsychologists as individuals involved in civil litigation. This is the more classic. If if somebody is involved in a car accident, for example, they are claiming to have sustained head injuries and they are suing, then this is what we typically think of as neuropsychologists becoming involved in the forensic arena. We know it's much broader than that, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes, but we also know that neuropsychologists have started branching out and doing more criminal work as well. Forensic neuropsychology and the idea of a psychologist as an expert in the courtroom really emerged after the Jenkins v. United States ruling in 1962. And this ruling essentially allowed for a psychologist's opinion to be heard and appreciated in the courtroom. It was the first time that a psychologist was able to testify about mental disease or defect. That's the language that they use in the court. And after that, psychologists were able to testify about mental functioning. And therefore, this paved a path really for psychologists as experts in a variety of areas. But specifically as it relates to forensic neuropsychologists, this is something that's really just began emerging in the 1980s and 1990s. As far as the role of forensic psychologists doing neuropsychological assessment, I have a very dated statistic listed in here, and I'll explain why I don't think we've seen as much of that. Back in 1995, Borum and Grisso found that approximately half of forensic psychologists use some type of neuropsychological evaluation in pretrial evaluations, so competence to stand trial, for example. And back in 1995, this was before the Houston Conference guidelines, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, but those really lay out the parameters for the type of training that's aspirational to become a neuropsychologist. So really, prior to the Houston Conference guidelines, there was a lot more dabbling so that psychologists in any specialty, could maybe do a little bit of neuropsych testing here and a little bit there. But what we know is now, in order to be a neuropsychologist, there are very clear guidelines about how to reach that path. And I would say it's much more delineated than it is even in terms of how to become a forensic psychologist. So I think if we were to see the statistic now, a contemporary version of it, it would be far less forensic psychologists that actually do any type of neuropsych evaluation unless they also have the special neuropsychological training. Rather, it's likely that forensic psychologists rely on they consult with a neuropsychologist to do that component of the evaluation. But nevertheless, we know that the idea of embedding neuropsychology or neuroscience within a forensic evaluation is growing, as evidenced by even the Making Neuro Work for You talk that Casey led up at APLS just last week, or the increasing attention in forensic conferences and meetings to the impact and the evolving neuropsychology and neuroscience and how it's used in the courtroom. Forensic work amongst neuropsychologists is perhaps one of, if not the fastest growing subspecialty within neuropsychology. And this has been cited kind of over and over again in articles in the last 5 years or so. And really in the past decade or two, this niche has been growing exponentially. Braun in 2011 found that there was a 6% average rate of growth in LexisNexis cases that referenced neuropsychology, and you can see that was back in 2005 to 2009. But in 2010, there was a 20% increase, and I suspect if we had the specific statistics today, it would be an even greater increase. Lawyers in particular really seem to appreciate the input from forensic neuropsychologists because of our scientific approach, the value of the quantitative data, and the fact that we're aware of judicial standards and how to provide expert testimony and are thoughtful about what would be admissible versus what is not admissible. I think it's important to include this. I wanted everybody to see, some of you may be familiar with this, but if you're not, within the field of neuropsychology, there's something called a salary survey that comes out usually every 5 years. They're actually collecting data for the new one currently, and I can't wait to see it. It comes out in the Clinical Neuropsychologist, or TCN. It's one of the leading journals within neuropsychology. It's also contributed by the American Academy of Clinical Neuropsychology, that's AACN. So the most recent that I have for you is 2010, but you can see here, these are the demographics variables and for looking at forensic practice. So you can see that more males than females are involved in forensic practice. But in general, if you look at the numbers of the respondents to this survey, which was sent out to basically all neuropsychologists in the United States, the majority of people do some sort of forensic practice, and more so by males than females. And you can see that it breaks it down by work setting, whether it's private practice or institution, and whether people identify as a pediatric, adult, etc. neuropsychologist. When you look at the incomes and frequencies, depending on how much forensic activity you conduct, you can see here that, for example, if you're doing about 50% of forensic work, the mean psychology income was $219, the median being $180. But you can tell by looking at these numbers essentially that adding forensic work is absolutely another stream of revenue. And that is a good thing as it relates to working, but it has also introduced concerning variables in that individuals see forensic work as an opportunity to make a lot of money, or they think it's going to make a lot of money, and then sometimes get into evaluations that really they're not competent to be conducting. So my hope is that as this niche continues to evolve, everyone is going to be more aware of how to get the appropriate training, and for myself included, I think that it's going to be a lifelong opportunity to learn as the niche continues to grow. I know I provided the TCN article through Casey. So I know he's going to make it available if he hasn't already to everyone on here. And I would say keep your eye out for the new one whenever it probably won't be published until 2016 would be my guess, since they're still collecting data. However, it's really a great survey. It does not just look at salary, actually. It looks at a lot of information about practice. And so I think it's very, very informative and practical. So what are some examples of criminal forensic neuropsychological evaluations that you could get involved in? One would be competence to stand trial. Not that long ago, I was involved in evaluation of an individual who had sustained several gunshot wounds, including several to the frontal lobe area. And the attorneys wanted to know, will this individual ever be restorable? Can they ever be competent to stand trial again? Or is he so neurologically or neuropsychologically impaired that he cannot be restored? And this individual had a history of aphasia as well as suspected feigning or exaggerating of symptoms. It's a very interesting evaluation, and it was a great example of when neuropsychological tests really contributed to answering that legal question, the legal question being, is this person competent, and if not, can they be restored? And so I think it was a great example of how the data and the neuropsychological evaluation really fit in nicely with the forensic purpose. MSOs, or mental status at the time of the offense, are also known as criminal responsibility or sanity evaluations. Sometimes individuals may claim amnesia, and neuropsychological testing, again, can provide some insight into the validity of those reports. Mitigation, Atkins hearings, so determining about the possibility of execution in capital sentencing cases. Civil forensic neuropsychological evaluations, and recall that this is where I would say neuropsychology really has a much longer history in the forensic world. But independent medical evaluations, that would be an example of what I mentioned earlier about if someone's in a car accident and they believe they've sustained a head injury and are potentially suing. A neuropsychologist could be hired by the plaintiff or by the defense to evaluate the individual for validity and severity of those reported symptoms. Also, something that I do here in my private practice are fitness for duty and fitness for practice evaluations. So I've done quite a few evaluations of physicians where the hospital that they work for, either the hospital or a licensing board, has raised a concern about their ability to practice competently because of some issue, whether it be a behavioral issue or MS or Parkinson's or another type of neurobehavioral problem that can impact their functioning. And in these, it involves conducting a neuropsychological evaluation and making recommendations and conclusions about the individual's fitness, basically to return to their medical practice. And these are a pretty interesting area of practice as well. And you can see testamentary capacity, workers' comp, a type of administrative evaluation. These are just some of the civil and criminal, as I mentioned, type of evaluations. So what does it take to be competent to perform forensic evaluations? The only way I could really tie in everything together for this presentation is, as I mentioned earlier, to include what it takes to be competent to do forensic evaluations, what it takes to be competent to conduct neuropsychological evaluations, and then discuss the competence of doing forensic neuropsychological evaluations. So briefly, since the majority of the individuals on here are in school or training or early career professionals in the forensic world, I'll go over this quickly, but from the book, Psychological Evaluations for the Courts, which is an excellent gold standard of a textbook by Melton et al. In 2007, they identify several areas in which competence is really necessary. And it's important to note this is not an exhaustive list, of course, but if you're going to do forensic work, you have to be familiar with the legal system, not only nationally, but also particularly in your jurisdiction, what the federal standards would be if you're working in the federal system, etc. And this is an area that, of course, if you're in clinical psychology, unless you specifically seek out forensic training, you may not have this background, or unless you're a lawyer, in a prior life. So it is important, and the onus is really on you as someone conducting a forensic evaluation to be knowledgeable about your legal system. And I would add that it's not just knowledge about the legal system in your jurisdiction, it's also knowledge and familiarity with the courtroom culture, which I think are really two different things and are both equally important. You had to be familiar with forensic assessment instruments, the legal doctrines that are necessary, such as the amendments, for example, and how they're relevant to forensic evaluation, research, and then, I think very importantly are being aware of the demands of being an expert witness. And a lot of psychologists really shy away from any sort of legal work, whether it's custody evaluations or any of the evaluations I've already mentioned to you. I have a lot of friends that think that I'm crazy for wanting to do this type of work, but I personally enjoy it. I find it very stimulating and challenging, and I think that this is an area where you have to do some soul searching to determine if this is something that you want to be part of, because it does come with a lot of demands for your own competence. What does it take to be competent to perform neuropsychological evaluations? Again, not exhaustive, but you need to have a firm grounding in behavioral neuropsychology or neurology and the conditions, whether we're talking about Alzheimer's or a traumatic brain injury or a concussion or Parkinson's, etc., that can affect the central nervous system. And there are many, many, many conditions. And, of course, with the ongoing research, I'm sure we're going to uncover many more conditions. And so it's something that requires you to be very mindful and continue learning in these areas. Neuroanatomy, neuropathology, psychometrics, of course, it's very important to understand and truly understand, for example, what's a T-score and what's a reliable change index, etc. And these are the types of things that I think in graduate school some students find particularly painful. I know, for example, with the psychometrics, and you may think to yourself, when will I ever need to know this level of specific information? But trust me when I say that if you want to explore this career, you have to be very strong in all of these areas and more, but the areas that I've listed here. Test administration and interpretation. So if there are standardized administration instructions, you have to know those. And ecological validity, and I think that this is a really important element of competence. And what I mean by this is you have to understand how do these neuropsychological results actually translate to the real world. And that's important in a clinical setting when you're trying to provide feedback to the patient, but it's very important also in a courtroom setting where you may be speaking to a jury and they need to understand why a score on the block design from the WACE has any implications for the individual's ability to problem solve. So how do we become competent to perform forensic neuropsychological evaluations? Well, it's everything that I just mentioned for the specific neuropsych and specific forensic domains. But as I mentioned, there's also a culture within the courtroom and within specific forensic neuropsychology that I think is important that you're aware of. And we really, part of that culture and part of moving forward with gaining competence in this niche involves being very keenly aware of the ethical considerations as it relates specifically to court-related or forensic neuropsychological evaluations. Now, this is the NAND, National Academy of Neuropsychology, official statement from 2003 about some ethical considerations. Within forensic psychology, there are the APLS guidelines for specialty practice, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. But just to highlight a few of these, it's very important that if you're considering forensic neuropsychology, you're able to understand that you're not entering a treatment relationship, for example, with a client. And if you're working in doing an independent medical evaluation, and perhaps you're hired by the plaintiff's attorney, so the person who was purportedly injured in an accident, and they're coming to you for an evaluation, it's not uncommon that the individual may think that you're there to help them because, after all, from their perspective, you were hired by their attorney and you specialize in brain behavior relationships, so surely you will be able to help them and understand where they're coming from. But this, in fact, is very important to be careful about because we're not entering into a neuropsychology patient relationship. And in fact, it's important to explain that at the onset with the informed consent. Also, it's important to know, for example, about the release of raw data. Clinical neuropsychologists don't always think about having to release their data for the court. Now, it is true that if you're practicing clinical neuropsychology, even if you don't want to be involved in forensic work at all, it's very likely that if you're practicing full-time neuropsychology, you're going to get pulled into a forensic context at one point or another in your career. And so, but because it's likely, but it's not a frequent occurrence unless you're specifically doing forensic neuropsychology, sometimes psychologists are not aware of how to release the raw data. And there are a lot of implications and things that you need to know. So, for example, if an attorney pressures you to hand over the raw data from the WACE or from the TOM or from the WIMS, you would never do that. And there are ways that in almost all cases you would never do that. And being familiar with what, for example, Pearson's responses to attorneys that try to force you to release the raw data, that would be an important thing to know. I was involved in a case not too long ago where an attorney was adamant that I just give him all of my raw data and that he would pass it on to the other expert on the other side. And what was the big deal? This attorney got very upset and actually even hung up on me at one point and could not understand why I couldn't just release the data for him to take a look at and make, quote, make sense of, end quote, before he passed it on to the other expert. And this was a unique circumstance because it was also the attorney that had hired me. And normally that attorney works well with their own expert. So it was an interesting situation. And again, it's important to seek out consultation when you're faced with these ethical considerations. And there are many in the forensic neuropsychology realm. So now I've provided some background, a little bit about the history, the growing field within forensic neuropsychology, what are the different types of evaluations that you could do. And I think it's important to spend the latter part of this talk discussing the requisite training for this area. As I mentioned already, forensic neuropsychology is not in and of itself its own identified, clear specialty area with clear guidelines. Really, in my opinion, you need to be a very strong clinical psychologist first, and then build upon the skills in seeking out specific training in forensic and clinical neuropsychology. And the path toward becoming a clinical neuropsychologist is much more strictly defined than it is to becoming a forensic psychologist. And so and because of that, and because of the fact that the majority of individuals involved in this type of work are already getting the forensic training, I'm going to spend a lot of attention on becoming a clinical neuropsychologist. And I just see that somebody wrote in the chat box about counseling psychology, and yes, that is included. I would say that there are far fewer counseling psychologists involved in this area, but that may just be because of the interest amongst counseling psychology programs rather than it being a factor that you can't do it. You absolutely can. And so let me take a look at briefly forensic psychology. I imagine everyone on here is familiar with the specialty guidelines. These are published and they're on the website, the PLLC website. They're easy to find, and I've also given them to Casey to produce to anybody who wants them. And these guidelines really are aspirational, but they lay out the ideal competence, etc., that you would have if you're working within forensic psychology. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time rehashing those. But I do want to say also that serves as a springboard to, you should review that and think, oh, am I doing these sorts of things because this is what I need to be competent in forensic psychology. But also, if you're considering with your eye, if you're looking with your eyes toward the future and considering board certification in forensic psychology, I think it's important to know, well, what do they say I need to have to be competent? And this was taken, I just looked today because I do sometimes update these standards to see what you have to have for a forensic specialization from the American Board of Professional Psychology, or ABPP, website. And you can see here at least 100 hours of formal education, direct supervision, and at least 1,000 hours of experience in forensic psychology. And much of this is obtained through a formal postdoctoral fellowship in forensic psychology. So again, I didn't want to spend a lot of time on forensic psychology and the requisite training because I think the majority of you are familiar with that based on your own training programs. I would say, if you're not already, I really You cannot hear me right now? Okay. Okay, wonderful. Sorry about that. I'm not sure what sort of technological glitch that was. So I was just speaking with Casey. He mentioned that maybe we were just getting ready to get started on the Houston conference whenever I lost you guys. So let me pick back up right here. So I was saying that in order to become a forensic psychologist, I would encourage you to look at the specialty guidelines, look at what it takes to become board certified in forensic psychology, seek out research and advocacy and training opportunities through externship, and you know, if you can get some forensic training on internship, that should align you nicely for a postdoctoral fellowship in forensic psychology. I should add that none of this is black and white. This is a new evolving area, and again, there's no absolute rule that if you don't do this, then you can't do that. If there were one of these specialty areas, forensic or neuropsychology, that did have very specific guidelines about what you have to do in order to become that, it is neuropsychology. The Houston Conference guidelines provide aspirational training guidelines. And again, these are going to be provided by Casey. I sent them to him, so everyone should have these. And you can read through them. But basically, these aspirational guidelines spell out what you need to do to become a neuropsychologist. And there's no equivalent really like this within forensic psychology yet. That might change. I mean, certainly there are training standards and aspirations for postdoctoral training, but nothing this specific starting at the undergraduate, graduate level. So the Houston Conference guidelines really suggest that you need to start early. You need to plan and try to get coursework on neuropsychology at the graduate level, certainly externship and practicum at the graduate level, and then if you can have an internship in neuropsychology, and it doesn't have to be an internship that's all neuropsychology. It could be an internship that has a neuropsychology rotation, for example, or even neuropsychology opportunities, even if it's not a formal rotation. But the Houston conference does also specifically lay out the aspiration that you will have had the postdoctoral training in clinical neuropsychology as well. And these areas in neuropsychology that you need to have training on postdoc are spelled out very clearly throughout the Houston conference, but also on a variety of websites, which I'm going to provide to you at the end of this talk. So again, clinical neuropsychology, the path really starts early, and I know we have a wide range of people listening in on this webinar, but I would say that you need to start as early as you can if you're thinking about pursuing neuropsychology, because you do need to get a lot of experience, ideally, because postdoctoral fellowships are very competitive. And if you can, doing some research in neuropsychology, doing clinical work, these are the sorts of things that will really prepare you nicely when it comes time to applying for postdoctoral fellowships. And really, the Houston Conference guidelines apply to people that are practicing and graduated on or after January 1st of 2005. So you may know of people who are neuropsychologists that didn't do a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship. And that may be because they graduated before these Houston Conference guidelines came out. Now, granted, they are aspirational, but they are very much treasured and revered in the field. So even though they're not mandatory, I would encourage you that if you want to pursue this path, you start thinking about it very early. I wanted to call your attention to the National Academy of Neuropsychology, or NAND, as I've already mentioned to you. You can go on this website after the webinar if you're not already familiar with it. I highly encourage you to go on there. There are a lot of resources on there. They just started a student division, which is a really great opportunity for predominantly forensic folks also to learn more about neuropsychology. And I'm also the chair of the Women in Leadership Committee within NAND, and through that I have a really great opportunity to advocate for women in the field, but also for everybody in the field, and especially students. And I'm probably more involved with NAND than some of the other neuropsychology organizations, which are also excellent, and I'm going to call your attention to at the end. But I just want to say that this has some resources on here that I think you would all find invaluable, and some position papers, etc., that you may want to take a look at if you're considering this route. Also, just for your own information, there's the Association for Doctoral Education in Clinical Neuropsychology, the Association for Internship Training in Clinical Neuropsychology, and then kind of at the end of the stage here, we have the Association for Postdoctoral Programs in Clinical Neuropsychology. So you can see, especially if you're a predominantly forensic person, that neuropsychology has far more organizations and groups, and this is only some of them, that are dedicated to training individuals to becoming a neuropsychologist. If you were to ask me, well, do I have to do a postdoctoral fellowship in forensic psychology and clinical neuropsychology? The answer to that is no, you don't have to. If you had to do one in either area, I would say you would need to do it in neuropsychology, because as I've highlighted, that really is a path that's very clearly delineated. Obviously, I think you can get the optimum training in both areas having done 2 postdocs. However, again, if you're nearing the end of your doctoral training, maybe even the end of internship or beginning of internship this coming year, and you're starting to think, should I do a postdoc in forensic or should I do a postdoc in neuropsych? I would strongly encourage you to pursue a postdoc in neuropsych first. And then either seek one in forensic afterwards, or seek continuing education, supervision, mentorship, and sponsorship within forensic psychology afterwards. And I want to speak briefly about board certification. This is kind of the end goal. It is not necessary, and I will openly admit that obviously I am biased in that I think that this is a great use of your time. This really allows you to seek certification saying that you've reached the highest level of practice and the highest, you know, level of expertise in your specific area. There are other boards that provide certification besides the ABPP. I would just encourage you, if you're considering this eventually, that you make sure it's not a vanity board. There are, in fact, some boards that you can just pay money for, and then they'll call you, you know, board certified in whatever area. So, but the ABPP certifies you people in a lot of different areas. It's on their website. You can take a look at it. But obviously, for this talk, I'm going to be talking about forensic and neuropsychology. And again, if you're considering pursuing these niches, I think it's good to look, you know, maybe 5 steps ahead. Even though this is later down the line, you wouldn't pursue this till really, you know, probably after you're licensed or start thinking about it when you're working on your licensure. But it doesn't hurt to go ahead and look. And also, the reason I put this specific screenshot is because they have a early entry program where instead of paying $125 to preliminary register, you can pay only $25, whether you want to seek certification in forensic or neuropsychology or another area, or multiple areas. So I think this is a great option. I also want to say that within forensic, the American Academy of Forensic Psychology, which works with ABAP, they offer a scholarship for individuals who complete a formal postdoctoral fellowship in forensic psychology, wherein they will reimburse you each step of the way if you pass the board certification process. Now, that may or may not be available in the continuing years. Of course, I can't attest to that, but depending on where you are in your career, it might be something worth looking into. Neuropsychology really aligns trainees to become board certified. That is really the end goal of fellowship, is to become board certified. This is a process that can take. Can everybody hear me? Okay, great. And so I would suggest that, again, you know, if you had to seek board certification in forensic or neuropsychology, if you didn't want to do both, then probably neuropsychology is the area where there are far more neuropsychologists board certified than there are forensic. Obviously, I think that there's benefit to doing both, but I also understand there's life and a lot of other things to do. And so it's just something to think about in terms of prioritizing. I also want to add that I've spent the majority of the talk talking about adult forensic neuropsychological evaluation, but a lot of the areas that I mentioned, for example, the independent medical evaluations, those can be done in pediatric case. A lot of what I mentioned that can actually be done within peds. There are less training opportunities within pediatric forensic neuropsychology, just as there is less with pediatric forensic or pediatric neuropsych training. However, ABAP now has a subspecialty where you can get board certified in pediatric neuropsychology subspecialty. So that's something you may want to look at if you're interested in that area. Okay, the benefits of board certification, I've mentioned that I do think from a professional perspective, it basically says to the courtroom, you've reached that high level of competence. Of course, it doesn't mean quit there. You need to keep learning and continue working. But it also can allow you to get paid more. Some institutions will actually give you a raise if you're board certified. In private practice, you can typically charge more if you're board certified. Personally, I think it's just rewarding. It's not like studying for the licensure exam or some of the other perhaps more mundane feeling exams. It is studying for something that you're really interested in, and it really provides a feeling of personal accomplishment that I think is, makes it worthwhile. So how do we integrate forensic neuropsychology? And what do we think about the future? Well, I've already alluded to the fact that I think the future is only going to continue to grow, frankly. We've seen that in the citations and LexisNexis and the research at the APLS conferences and the neuropsych conferences, there are increasing number of time workshops, etc., dedicated to forensic neuropsychology. And who can do it? Well, as I mentioned to you, really, in my opinion, who can do it are the people who are competent and have sought the appropriate training in both forensic and clinical neuropsychology. I really caution you to avoid dabbling in one or the other, because this is an area that, has can have a lot of impact on the society as well as the individual that you're working with. We've talked about what it is and when can you do it. There are a lot of areas in which you can do it, where you can do it in private practice. You can do it in some hospitals. A lot of individuals that I know don't only do forensic neuropsychology, and that includes myself. In my private practice, while I would say the majority is forensic neuropsychology, I certainly also do clinical neuropsychology and pure forensic psychology that doesn't involve any neuropsychological testing. And how can we get there? Well, I've outlined some of the steps, and I just wanted to say to you that my email is going to be on the last slide of this, and I'm very happy to discuss any of this more with any of you individually in the future if you have any questions. I think it's very important to seek out mentorship and sponsorship, and I know that can be very hard to do in rural areas or in areas where there's not a lot of opportunities, such as to get involved in forensic neuropsychology. And again, because it really is such a new niche, you're likely not to find many specific internships or specific training programs that really give you that specialization. It's going to require a lot of proactive work on your behalf. So in closing, the top 5 suggestions, as I was thinking about what would I want you to know based on my experience thus far, and I would, I'm an early career professional still, so I think that this is just where I'm at currently. I'd be interested to see what I would suggest maybe 10 years from now. But one is, you really need to do your research and know what you're getting into, and that is obviously the truth for any niche within psychology. But certainly, if we're talking about forensic neuropsychology, you're talking about a doctoral degree, which could be let's say on average 5 or 6 years. And then anywhere from 1 to 3 years of postdoctoral fellowship, depending on how you decide to pursue that. But you could think at least 2 years if you're going to do the neuropsych piece. And then, somewhere along that way, you'll get licensure, and if you decide to pursue board certification. The point is, it's a commitment, and you have to, I would just encourage you to really do your research, talk to people, talk to me. If I can be helpful, I'm happy to. And become a really good clinical psychologist first. There are a few programs that specialize and really only train people in forensic or only train people in neuropsychology. And those programs can be great, but sometimes those programs don't include enough of the basic clinical psychology core that I think is really important as a springboard to thrust you into future training in forensic or neuropsychology. And I would also say, please strive for competent practice and really have high standards for yourself, because the courtroom is certainly going to, and your clients are going to, and deserve that as well. So you want to make sure that, once you get the postdoc, it's not over. Once you get board certified, it's not over. You have to keep learning. Seeking out the multitude of opportunities I discussed, thinking outside of the box. If you're going to become a clinical neuropsychologist, clinical neuropsychology as a field has really evolved a lot, and now with the Affordable Care Act, people that are doing clinical neuropsychology are really seeing, and are starting to see, and will continue to see, a whole new world as it relates to practice, and it's going to have significant implications for us all. So thinking outside of the box might include getting trained and learning about forensic work, for example, but also maybe looking at other avenues rather than just clinical work, such as research or advocacy. And then be proactive, get involved, and I said earn, seek, and serve as a sponsor. A lot of mentor and sponsor are used interchangeably a lot, but there is a difference I won't go into right now. But I would say that, earn a sponsor by being a good worker, by having a good attitude and being dedicated to what you're doing. Seek out sponsors and mentors, and serve as one whenever you have the opportunity to do it and pay it forward. For additional information, here are some of the websites I mentioned to you. The other neuropsychology groups that are great: INS is International Neuropsychological Society, Division 40 within APA, the Society for Clinical Neuropsychology. They have a student group, the Association for Neuropsychology Students in Training, the Interorganizational Practice Committee. All of these are great. I'm in New York City, so New York State Association of Neuropsychology and New York Neuropsychology Group are great. I encourage you to look at your state psychological associations. There are some journals, the TCN and ACN and Law and Human Behavior, that are relevant. I added these two websites because I think they're very interesting from a neuroscience perspective, Brain Blogger and Human Connectomy. These books are fantastic as well. And in that, I'm going to close, and I actually don't see my email address coming up on here, so maybe I'll have Casey send that out to you, if you can do that, Casey.
Yep, I'm doing that right now.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I will go back to the side of the book. So any questions, I'm happy to answer.
So before we start with the question and answer, let me give you guys a sense of how this is going to look, and I'm just putting in your email, so let me finish that real quick. And there we go. So thank you for all of that information. It looks like we already have a lot of questions, but feel free to keep those rolling in the chat box. We also have the opportunity here to ask your question live. So if you'd like to do that, you can raise your hand by clicking on My Mood at the top of the page and then raising your hand. I will be able to unmute you. You can ask your question and I'll mute you again. It's a great option if anyone wants to ask Dr. Tussey live. But to begin with, I think one question that seems to incorporate a lot of what people are asking about is there seems to be differing opinions on the value of board certification. We talked about that a lot. But Stephanie from Texas is asking kind of what are your thoughts on that? And do you find that attorneys are seeking professionals with board certification? And then do you think it would be better to be board certified in forensic or neuro?
That's a great question. Let me just say to Casey and to everyone, I'm mindful of the time. I am happy to go over 8, but I know I want to respect your time as well. But in the interest of answering questions, I'm fine with going over.
Okay, yeah, I think we'll go over a little bit and then see what people want to do.
Okay. That's a great question with regard to board certification. I know that there are a lot of mixed opinions about it. Again, I'm going to just be very honest. Clearly, I'm biased because I am board certified. And so I found that there are benefits to it, not just because of the things that I mentioned in the talk and all what it says on the ABPP website in terms of your professional how it really is a mark of professional accomplishment, and that does bear out in the courtroom. So to your question, has it made a difference? I would say yes. I've certainly testified and have never been asked if I'm board certified, but I have also been testified and I've also testified and have been asked on multiple occasions if I'm board certified. I have found that the board certification, a lot of attorneys see that as not an automatic, okay, then you must be really good or you're competent, but it certainly does give them another layer of, confidence maybe in your work. Now, not all attorneys know what it is, of course, and, I think you have to consider that. It's a lot of work, but I have found it rewarding. I have found that it has positively impacted my private practice, my time whenever I have testified. Have I ever been turned down from a case because prior to being board certified? Not that I'm aware of. But one time specifically, just to share an example with you, I did, before I was board certified, I was in a pediatric civil litigation case and was asked why I was not board certified. And this, discuss it. So again, it puts you in a situation. I think that, is it better forensic or neuropsych? I did forensic first because I had that scholarship that I mentioned to you guys. So from a timing perspective, it made more sense to do the forensic first, but I am also pursuing the neuropsych. I think that neuropsychology is the area where the expectation is very clear that when you're done with postdoc, you will get board certified. I think that's becoming the expectation in forensic work, but I think it is the expectation in neuropsychology. So I think, you can interpret that how you will, but I think that it's certainly beneficial. It has been to my practice anyway.
All right, thanks. So we got a question from Maya, who is wondering if you could talk a little bit about your fee structure for assessments and talk about how much is typically charged per assessment and like how many hours it takes to do in a normal assessment.
So how much I charge, I would say that if you're looking at practice, you really have to look regionally and see what people in your area are charging. So whenever I started my private practice, I did a lot of meeting with other private practitioners and attorneys to try to figure out what the going rate, so to speak, is for this area. If you look at that TCN salary survey that I gave you, it talks about, and this is back in 2010, so let's see what comes out next year. But you can see that the average rate on that, I think, was around almost $300 an hour. How long it takes me to do an evaluation, and again, I'm speaking from my private practice perspective, not my hospital work. Private practice perspective, how long it takes really depends on the referral question, frankly. Some cases are much more straightforward and are under 10 hours. Some cases literally go on for a year or two. I'm working on a case right now that's been going on for a year and a half. I have at least 5 banker's boxes worth of records, and the attorney continues to give me more records. And so, that one is obviously going to take a lot more than 10 hours.
All right, thanks. So the next question, it's a twofer. So we have Justin asking if, based on your perspective of the field, are there any good internships that blend training in forensic psychology and neuropsychology? And then Michael is asking, on top of that, what about postdocs that specialize in both neuro and forensic?
Those are great questions. With regard to internships, actually, the internship that Casey just matched for is an excellent one. It's a new one, and it's a blend of it's mainly neuropsychology, but there are opportunities for forensic work. And I'm certainly working with Bill Barr, who's a well-known neuropsychologist who does a lot of forensic work. And so I think that would be a great opportunity, for example. Not to plug my own institution, but I'll say that at Bellevue, we have a forensic track. And that's a specific track, and then I am obviously the individual that if you were to do a neuropsychology rotation, there's an opportunity for blending some forensic and neuropsychology. At some of the Bureau of Prisons, I believe that there are some opportunities for forensic neuropsychology. I would say that when you're looking for internships, you just want to see that it's a neuropsychologist on staff, because sometimes places will say that they offer neuropsych opportunities, but it's kind of neuropsychology light, if you will. Like you might be doing an MMSE or something that they may call neuropsychology, but it's not the same as being supervised by an actual neuropsychologist. Was there another part of that question?
Yeah, but before the next question is adding on to that about postdocs, but I also want to talk about, in my search, I looked for programs that provided both opportunities, and I ended up at NYU, and I also looked at the Bellevue site. 2 other sites that I was really impressed with that blend the two very well are Patton State Hospital in Patton, California. It's a state forensic hospital, and they have a neuropsych track. So you'd be doing neuropsychology the entire time there with an inpatient population. So it's not exactly neuropsych, it's more focused on forensic, but they do a very good job there, and the supervisors there blew me away. The other one is St. Joe's in Hamilton, Ontario. That's been in the chat box, and I went there as well to interview, and they're great. They offer full streams in both neuropsychology and forensic psychology, and you can do a major and minor rotation in both. They also have forensic psychologists that work in neuropsychology and neuropsychologists that work in the forensic psychology service. So there's a lot of good opportunities there. And Marta was their intern, I think, last year. So you can ask her any questions that you have as well. So yeah, Dr. Tussey, if you could now extend it to postdocs, if you know of any good postdocs that blend the two.
Yeah, so I know, again, I don't want to tout my own background, but I will just say that the University of Virginia was an incredible training opportunity for me, and they have both a forensic postdoctoral fellowship and a neuropsychology postdoctoral fellowship and several other postdoctoral fellowships. The nice thing about UVA is that they have you move through as a cohort, so with all the other postdocs. So even when I was a forensic postdoc, I had interaction, and part of my work was at a state hospital, which, by the way, is another great place to look for internships and postdocs with the mix of training. But at the state hospital, I had a lot of interaction with the neuropsychology postdoc when I was the forensic postdoc. And we had case conferences, so there was a lot of overlap. And then when I went on to do the neuropsychology postdoc, I still did a lot with the forensic, the Institute of Law, Psychiatry and Public Policy, and so I was able to really keep my hands in both. So UVA, I think, has a great opportunity to blend those. I don't know of any pure forensic neuropsychology postdoc, like that's just one postdoc you apply to that's maybe 3 years long, for example. I don't know of that, but I know that in Massachusetts, there are opportunities as well. Obviously, great forensic training there, and also there are some really great neuro training opportunities there where, again, it may be similar to UVA in that even though it's not a formal forensic neuropsychology postdoc per se, because of the great opportunities with the both training programs, you may be able to have some overlap.
Okay, great. So Sean from California has a question. He seems to be doing an internship or a practicum that is more general in its focus, and he's wondering, because there aren't specific forensic or neuropsych opportunities there per se, what's the best way to incorporate neuropsych into or from the assessment into treatment, and do you think that he would be allowed to do that kind of testing on his patients? So could he include neuropsych testing even though there's not a formal training component in that?
And this is on externship or practicum?
I'm not sure. I'm going up to check.
Well, let me just say that if you're at in an institution where there's not the formal neuropsychology testing opportunities, for example, whether it's permissible or not, I think it would really depend on the site and the supervisors. Because even if it might be indicated with the patient population, it wouldn't be appropriate if the supervisor is not appropriately trained, to supervise neuropsychology, for example. So I think it would really be institution specific, and I would encourage all of you, if you're thinking of seeking that sort of training opportunity, that when you're interviewing for places or once you've got, when you're interviewing, to ask then, even if there are opportunities. Sometimes even if it's not a formal track, then you can create those sort of opportunities for you in some institutions, depending on their flexibility.
Okay, great. So we have a question. I always love to see questions that incorporate a multicultural perspective, and I think this is a really good one. So we'd like to hear about the struggles, or if you've encountered any struggles regarding credibility in court or profession due to your gender. So we have a person on here that's noticed an underrepresentation of women in this field, and she'd love your perspective on it.
That is a really fantastic question, and one that's near and dear to my heart, not just because obviously I'm a woman, but I'm also an early career professional. And it's so near. Obviously, I'm the chair of the Women in Leadership Committee in NAND, and I think that's how important I think that it is. And as I pointed out on the TCN, again, 2010, but that salary survey, there are far more men doing forensic work than there are women. I would say in my experience so far, I have not encountered too many problems. If anything, I think it's kind of a situation specific and an attorney specific kind of thing. I have certainly worked with male attorneys that are much more experienced and senior in their field than I am, and that have, talked somewhat condescendingly down to me or called me honey or sweetheart or things like that. And have even said things like, while I was testifying, I can think of one attorney in particular that made comments that I'm pretty certain he would not have made if A, I had been a man, or if I had been a woman that was perhaps more senior in my field. But I had, thankfully, in my experience, that's been the exception rather than the rule. And I try to just be proactive and deal with it in a way, by explaining who I am, being confident in who I am and what I can offer at the onset, and just entering it with that in mind. But it is something, it is something that you have to think about. Certainly in the courtroom in general, it is still, I would say, more of a male-dominated kind of arena, and I think you can help yourself in that area by being as competent as you possibly can, and regardless of your age or your gender.
All right, and we just got in a really good one from Octavio too. He's asking, what are the challenges of doing cross-cultural forensic neuropsych, specifically working with non-English speakers?
Well, what a great question. And since I'm at Bellevue Hospital, I work with a lot of non-English speaking patients. Also, it is very much a challenge. I would say it's a challenge with any testing, but it's especially a challenge when we're talking about potentially having to stand in a court and testify about the data that you collected and whether or not it's valid. Some of the challenges, one of the obvious challenges is if you don't speak the language. Now, obviously, that's one of a whole host of multicultural considerations you have to take into account. But we're very fortunate at Bellevue because it's Bellevue and it's in New York City. We have a lot of different interpretive services available to us, but frankly, a lot of them are available by phone. We actually have quite limited face-to-face interpretation opportunities for testing anyway, because testing is a really long, can be hours-long process. And so in those times, it's actually quite challenging, and sometimes we have to say, no, we can't do the evaluation because it wouldn't be appropriate to, you can't do testing with a phone interpreter a lot of times, or there are no norms that are even remotely appropriate for the individual. And I think that the onus, again, is on us as the forensic neuropsychologist to think about all of these implications before you even say yes to a case. In my private practice, I've been approached, actually just last week, about doing an evaluation of someone who did not speak English. And they offered to provide an interpreter, but it was a high-stakes type of evaluation also, and the interpreter was not even an actual trained interpreter for doing evaluations. And that's what happens a lot of times. Attorneys will say, oh, their brother, sister, mother knows, can interpret for you, and that's obviously problematic for a lot of reasons. So I think the onus is on us to think about all of these implications before we even say, yes, I can test this person.
All right, great. So I think it's 8:11 on the East Coast, so we're going to call it there. I'd like to thank Dr. Chriscelyn Tussey for speaking today about forensic neuropsychology, essential information to know before embarking on a path less but increasingly traveled. We hope this webinar provided you with relevant and useful information. And please feel free to reach out to Dr. Tussey. I put in her email in the chat box, as well as the APLS Student Committee if you have further questions. A recording of this webinar will be available on the Student Committee website shortly. We invite everyone to check out our website for a listing of upcoming webinars, as well as an archive of our past webinars. Just so you guys know, our next webinar will be held on Friday, April 10th. It will feature a panel of experts discussing how to find and obtain a research postdoc in law and psychology. So please check out the website or our Facebook and Twitter pages for registration information. I'm going to put those in the chat box as well. And that's it. So thank you again, Dr. Tussey, and to everyone who participated tonight, and hope you have a great night.
Thank you very much, and anybody feel free to contact me if you have any questions. I'd be happy to help.
All right, thanks, everyone.